Today is Wednesday, August 2nd, 2023, and the time is 10:46 a.m. We are at the COFO Center in Jackson. My name is Alissa Rae Funderburk, the oral historian for the Margaret Walker Center, and I'm here with my colleague and coworker, Miss Angela Stewart, archivist of the Margaret Walker Center. Ms. Stewart, could you say and spell your name for the record?
Yes, Angela Stewart, Angelastewart.
Thank you. And do I have your permission to record this interview?
Yes.
Great. So I'd like to first start with you telling me when and where you were born and a little bit about your upbringing.
Okay. Well, I was born May 4th, 1961, right here in Jackson, Mississippi, in the segregated basement of the Baptist Hospital here in Jackson. My mother had to be a civil rights activist throughout her pregnancy. Her initial obstetrician wanted her to use a separate waiting room, and she said no, so she ended up changing obstetricians, and I was actually delivered by the family physician, Dr. Robert Ireland, because of, her problems with dealing with, you're pregnant with your first child and you have to deal with segregation too. So you're like, no, that's one problem too many. But I grew up here in Jackson. I'm a graduate of the Jackson Public Schools, where I attended Robert Moody Callaway High School. At an interesting time, integration came to Jackson Public Schools in 1970. I graduated from high school in 1979, and already the schools were beginning to re-segregate. And not for legal reasons, but for geographical reasons, because white flight had fully begun, and there just weren't, as many white people to attend Jackson Public Schools as there had been. I attended Alcorn State University, the United States' first land-grant institution, founded in 1871. And I was a history major there. Now, I've always loved history. It's born in me. Both of my parents were social studies majors at Jackson State University, but beyond that, they both had great passion for history, whether it be family history, community history, just history in general. And so, like I said, I grew up with that. And history as a form of activism is something I grew up with as well, because both of my parents were advocates for students, for community, for civil rights through their work as teachers. So that's, like I said, love of history and the importance, because, a lot of times people say, oh, history is just learning dates and numbers, but it was never just that for me. It was always about people and community and family. So it was a natural fit for me when I went to Alcorn to major in history. And as somebody said at AAAM, you get one of these degrees and people go, hey, but what you gonna do with that? So I did what you do with that. I went to graduate school. I went to Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. And I had the opportunity to major in public history, which gave me the opportunity to work at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. And I ironically worked under Dr. Lonnie Bunch, who's now the Smithsonian Secretary, first African-American Smithsonian Secretary. And I had the opportunity to do research for an upcoming community life exhibit on the Tuskegee syphilis study. So I spent the summer at the Georgetown University's bioethics library, at Howard University, and just the National Library of Medicine in Bethesda, researching the United States' involvement in what became known as the Tuskegee syphilis study. After graduate school, I returned to Mississippi, really for family reasons. My mom was dealing with her parents' decline in health, my maternal grandmother declined in health by herself, and so I came back largely to support her and help out with the family. So I initially did substitute teaching. I substitute taught in Jackson Public Schools. I ended up teaching French and English. French, I'm like, I flunked French in college, but here I am teaching French. But so the students and I actually learned French together. But then I had the opportunity to come to a conference at the Margaret Walker Center, sponsored under Dr. Albertine Harrison, about communities and history and how to connect communities in history. And the Pineywood School had sent a couple of people there who said they were looking for an archivist, and I was looking for an archival position, and so I interviewed, and for 12 years I served as the archivist for the Pineywood School. And from there, Dr. Harrison reached out to me and said, we need a new archivist at the Margaret Walker Center in 2004. Since 2004, I've been at the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State. In addition, I am Vice President of Women for Progress of Mississippi Incorporated. I host a podcast called History Matters every third Thursday of the month for womenforprogressradio.com. And the purpose of that is to connect history with the present. So a word that I use often is Sankofa. Matter of fact, the name of my book club is Sankofa Book Club, because it's about looking to the past to prepare for the present and the future. And that's what the podcast is about. So I connect what's going on today with what happened in previous times, and seeing how we need to look at how these things connect up. So I also, as I mentioned, I founded a reading group called the Sankofa Book Club, and we read a wide variety of stories. We have speakers such as Kiese Lehman and Benjamin Jealous, who've actually come and spoken with us as we've read their books. So that's something I do as well. And I'm an active member of the Sunday School Class 11 at New Hope Baptist Church, where I teach. Matter of fact, I'm doing a presentation this coming Sunday. So those are the kinds of things I do.
Well, thank you. Mm-hmm. You gave me a lot to work with, but I think I'm going to try and go back towards the beginning. You mentioned that you were your mom's first pregnancy. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit about the rest of your family, your siblings?
Oh, yes. I am the daughter of the late Dorothy Thompson Stewart Samuel and Peter Herbert Stewart. And it's interesting, my parents were born in the same hospital 4 years apart. They were born at the Vicksburg Charity Hospital, but they didn't meet until they were students at Jackson State, then college. My parents have two additional children together. I have a younger sister, Monica Stewart Wilson, and a younger brother, Peter Stewart III. I also have some half-siblings on my father's side as well. Actually, three sisters and a brother on my father's side as well. Two sisters and a brother. It's 6 altogether. They have to keep track. But yeah, so and it's interesting. A story my brother always remembers: when we first moved into the neighborhood where we grew up in Jackson Valley North, it was still a predominantly white neighborhood. But we liked to walk, and we would walk up to Jack's Hamburgers into the store, and just buy little things like kids do. So it was my sister and brother and I, and these white kids started picking on my brother. My brother's the baby; he's the youngest. And I had this purse at the time that was this stiff kind of, not leather, but kind of stiff, and it had a big buckle, and I just started swinging. He said, I was scared of you at that moment, but I was like, I was not letting them, harass my baby brother. I made that clear. So, and we're still well connected today, because my nieces and nephews and my siblings, we all get, connected, and we're working together to take care of my dad, who's living with me now.
Mm-hmm. And so your younger siblings, what was the age difference between the three of y'all?
Okay. I am 3 years older than my sister and 5 years older than my brother.
Okay, mm-hmm. Yeah, so you had to be protected.
Yes.
And so can you tell me a little bit more about your neighborhood growing up. You mentioned that you like to walk and you would go to Jack's, was it?
Yes, Jack's Hamburgers.
What-
My parents, when they got married, they initially moved into what had been a apartment complex for up and coming young couples, fresh out of college, just married, called Maple Street Apartments. Then they made enough money, they were able to purchase a home on 708 West Ash Street, which was in the heart of the black community known as Georgetown in Jackson. Georgetown is probably the third oldest black community in Jackson, outside Ferris Street and some other areas. And we lived there until my parents had the opportunity in 1974 to buy a house out in North Jackson in what was called Valley North. And Valley North was a relatively new subdivision in 74. It had been, Jackson kept expanding north and north until ultimately people were into Madison County and then east into Rankin County. But Valley North was an early northern suburb of Jackson. And like I said, it was initially built primarily for white people. But of course, as black families moved in, white families moved out. But while there was still a heavy mix, there was oftentimes conflict between white children and black children, and some children who weren't even either. They were Asian kids, but identified as white. So it could be really almost dangerous sometimes, because you had to know where you were walking and whose house you were passing by, because they might sick a dog on you, or they might, attack you themselves. So, but we loved to just, because at that time, we could walk from our house to a little shopping area where you could pick up inexpensive little things that kids buy, and food, and because there was a grocery store and a store we had in Jackson called TG&Y, which was kind of a, Walmart killed off those types of stores, because they were just stores you bought little trinkets and coloring books and all kinds of stuff, yard and garden supplies and things like that. And then a drugstore, at that time, Edwards Drugstore, all of it right and easy walking distance from my home, and a convenience store across the street from that. So it made sense to just, and it was a beautiful neighborhood. So whether you're riding your bicycles or walking, which are usually the safest way in our area, because there were high heels and you didn't want to be on roller skates going down the hills. But but you learn how to navigate. As I mentioned, I went to Callaway, and when I was at Callaway, I was in the academic accelerator program, and it really made for two schools in one. The general program was mostly African American students, and it consisted of both college prep, but mostly vocational education. And then there was an accelerator program where you could take, it was sort of a precursor to the advanced placement type of program. And usually they were just, like for one class, I always joke that my teacher had she didn't have to know the names. She could easily recognize my parents or the East Indian young lady, because we were the only non-whites in the class. So when our parents walked in, oh, I know who you are. And so that was the kind of, but it also, we had contentious arguments, because there were students then who were like, they wanted to boycott and ban Black History Month as being racist, reverse racist, and it was the big thing, because we had some early Ron DeSantis and Tate Reeves. But the interesting thing was, most of these white kids who were also popular with black kids who had no contact with them on a general basis other than what they saw on the football field or the basketball court or in the stage, because we were very strong, what I call A3 or a cube school, academics, athletics, and arts. With very strong programs in all three of those areas. But like I said, very disconnected in terms of, population, separation.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably largely the case in a lot of schools still today, where populations are so separated. I don't want to say segregated, but yeah, sometimes it happens that way too. But you mentioned, as you were talking about the neighborhood, and as you just mentioned, like Ron DeSantis, you said a lot of the stores were kind of killed by Walmart. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to kind of the change in Jackson since you were a kid and growing up here to coming back.
I'm old enough to remember the vibrancy of areas like the Meadowbrook Shopping Center, which the McRae's that was in that shopping center has been demolished. McRae's was a local department store owned by the McRae's family. And that's another thing that changed too. We've gone from local department stores to now regional or national chains, whether it be Belk's or Dillard's or in some areas like Macy's and things like that. But we had, and it was kind of a local accountability because these were people, you'd heard of even if you didn't know them. You knew about Richard McRae or Shelby McRae or McCarty Holman owned the Jitney Jungle grocery store chain. I went to high school with Rick McCarty and Renee Holman, who were descendants of the people who founded that chain. I went to high school with Randy Heron, whose family still owns Heron Gear. Well, then it was Chevrolet. I don't know. They do Mercedes and some other, not Lexus and things like that now. But there was a vibrancy of commerce, because this was before Lakeland Drive exploded. Matter of fact, Lakeland Drive East, it used to be called East Jackson. People were like, why would anybody want to live over there? Because it was just back, Rankin County and Madison County were literally just backwater. Jackson was the capital. It was everything, but we've had leadership who, the blacker Jackson gets, the less they see the importance or significance, including a governor who literally despises the city that sits as the seat of government in Mississippi. But, I grew up being able to leave church and walk to get my hair done or go order fish at a little fish shop or go shopping right down Fair Street, up and down Fair Street, and most of those places are gone, and it gave, but what's also happened, for example, in terms of church, most of the people who attend the church now live nowhere near the community. Whereas there were people who were going to Fair Street when I was growing up, who lived right across the street, who could literally walk across the street to church every Sunday. And that gave, a better sense of community. And, and it was home ownership was higher. A lot of what is happening in Jackson now is due to a reduction in home ownership, a lot of absentee landlordism and slumlords that don't care about the community. So those are the kinds of, like I said, just in my lifetime I've seen.
Right. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly the part about how much easier it was to build community when people owned homes and the
Mm-hmm.
places that they did their commerce and attended church and things like that. I think we think so much about the economical side of change over time and less so about how it affects us as a community. But speaking to that, I'm curious about Jackson State's place in community And I wonder if you can speak a little bit to like your experience and knowledge of Jackson State over time. You mentioned at the beginning that both of your parents attended.
Yes, yes, I'm the descendant of two proud Jackson State alums. And let me tell you what I mean by that. I work at the Margaret Walker Center, which is an air hall. And until they tore it down to build the new Johnson Hall, the original Johnson Hall was in that spot. And that was the social science classroom building. And my mom would come on campus with me, and I'm thinking she's going to follow me into Air Hall. And she's walking right past Air Hall, going to Johnson. I'm like, where are you going? She said, I'm going to see my classroom. Now, this is 50 years after she's attended class in Johnson Hall, but she still had that strong pull. Most of my conversations with my mom were about people like Margaret Walker, Jane Ellen McAllister, Benjamin Blackburn. These were people who taught her at Jackson State. So, of course, when anything happened at Jackson State, she made sure her children, especially me, were front and center. I got to see Maya Angelou because she couldn't come to the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival, but she promised Margaret Walker that she would come to campus, and she did. And so I got to see her at Jacksonian Lounge, reciting, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, which was the inspiration for the title of her first autobiography. So, I took piano lessons at Jackson State. Another building that's been torn down, Dansby Hall. In the basement of that building was the music department, and there were rehearsal space with pianos. And my piano teacher, that's where she taught me out of. I'd go over there to take piano lessons. I grew up attending Fair Street Baptist Church. The current building that is Fair Street Baptist Church was built under the leadership of Jacob L. Reddix, who was chairman of the Deacon Board and a member of the trustee board in the 1940s at Fair Street. And my mom always said she thought he got a two-for deal for the new sanctuary at Fair Street in Dansby Hall at Jackson State. So I attended summer programs at Jackson State. I spent a lot of time on the campus. My mother and I both, we knew people who worked, because a lot of my mother's classmates would go on to teach at Jackson State. She remained close to people like Margaret Walker and other people who had taught her at Jackson State. We attended church with them, so it was always this, Jackson State was this big part of our social life, our cultural life. There would be events that would happen on campus that we would, attend. I played the violin from 7th through 12th grade, and we would have what we call String Orchestra Festival in January of the year. And the last 2 years it was held on the Jackson State campus. So, so Jackson State was always a big part. And you have to understand people like James Meredith, Robert Walker, who would replace Charles Evers and Emmett Burns and Robert Walker would replace Charles Evers as state NAACP directors, were Jacksonians. People who loved Jackson State and had a rich history with Jackson State. And it was all, Jackson State was, especially here in Jackson, was always in the community, either as, individuals who worked there and their participation in the community, or things Jackson State provided for the community. Jacob L. Reddix helped found what was known as State Mutual Savings and Loan, which helped a lot of black people get mortgages to build homes. That's another change you see in Jackson. Dalton Street between Lynch and Highway 80, that was a corridor of homes that were financed by State Mutual, that were built by the Industrial Arts Department here at Jackson State. And, you know, as my mother would say, you know, people are very proud of their brick homes that they had right here, you know, by Jackson State. You know, it's kind of the hub of West Jackson. Because Jackson was interesting. Downtown was a primarily white business district. Then you had Jackson State in the West Jackson black community. Just beyond the West Jackson black community of Washington Addition and Gowdy, you had white communities. Matter of fact, that was part of the hostility that led to the 1970 Gibbs Green shooting, where these white people who were passing through Lynch Street to get to their homes off of Lynch on Arbor Vista and Buena Vista and those areas between Jackson State and Highway 80, the Highway 80 corridor. So yeah, Jackson was very important. You know, people like Marian Anderson came and performed at Jackson State. I mean, people came, you know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of things I learned in what you just said, including the ways in which Jacob Reddix helped people to be able to afford to have houses built in what would have been a prime location, so close to Jackson State. And I drive there now, and it's quite a difference.
Yeah, you know, Jacob L. Reddix was a very complex and complicated person. He had issues with women. He could be very sexist. He was very intent on protecting Jackson State, so a lot of that led to hostility with the civil rights community. Because, you know, he could literally look across the street at Campbell College, which closed because its white donors objected to its support of the civil rights movement. And he could be very controlling and treated, you know, because from the 40s to the 60s, Jackson State students were evolving. You know, originally Jackson State had adults primarily who were just going back to school to get a required degree, because education had shifted from allowing you to just have an 8th grade education and certificate to you needed at least a bachelor's degree. So there were a lot of students who were at Jackson State because they needed that additional education to continue to teach. But they weren't traditional students. And so they didn't need a school that functioned in the way a traditional college functions. And that's the beginning of Jacob Reddix's tenure. But by the late 40s, early 50s, you're beginning to get 18 to 20-something-year-olds who are going to college. And they want space to explore, to challenge, to question. And he wasn't having a lot of that. So that got to be an issue too. Because do you want college to be a place that molds people, or do you want it to be a place that just rubber stamps and you turn out these drones who have no thought of their own? You know, because Jackson State students fought the idea of Jackson State being what they called a Negro training school, which, because the idea that the white political leadership said, first of all, educating black people or even poor white people is not in the state's best interest. Mississippi has never felt that public education should be either free or universal. For them, there are whole groups of people who are better off without education. Plus, generally you pay for education with property tax. So why are you spending money educating people who have no property, who can't contribute to? So those kinds of things come into play. So because, you know, my dad came to Jackson State having gone first through 8th grade at Mount Moriah Baptist Church. I always say sort of like Little House on the Prairie, or church, church school. And then Utica Institute, because there was no high school for African American children in that area of Hinds County. So that's the other thing you dealt with at Jackson State. You had students who didn't have a lot of opportunity for education. But as the 50s rolled in, professional education was taking off. And you had things like the Mississippi Teachers Association, who were even putting out a journal called the Mississippi Educational Journal that talked about the need and importance of educators. And you also had the idea, the pushback initially to the Brown versus Board of Education decision was, okay, well, black people, if your problem is the condition of your schools, what if we build you new schools? Do you still need to go to our schools? So, and you had people who were principals and had leadership positions in separate schools who were now being turned out as, schools moved toward integration. So you had all these kinds, because, up until the early 60s, Jackson State's primary job was training educators. It's not until the push in, Jackson State will become a university in 1974. And it's not really a push for things beyond teacher education. I mean, they had things prior to that, but a real concentrated push in terms of research in advanced degrees beyond a bachelor's degree really came about and exploded after 1974.
I appreciate that context. It really helps to get a sense of the role that Jackson State would have been playing in the community, like prior to the years when you were growing up. And it makes me wonder about your parents and the time that they were attending Jackson State. You said that they were both social studies majors. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, like, what their educational experience was. It might not be something you can speak to very much, but I am curious about that. And, well, I'll just stop there for now.
Their educational experience at Jackson State?
Yeah, at Jackson State, yeah.
I could talk a lot about that because my mom, like I said, she loved her time at Jackson State. That was she would tell me, despite she went to Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts after she studied at the University of Mexico in Mexico City. She got a specialist degree from Ole Miss. She studied at Mississippi College, which was in her hometown. She said, but nothing topped the education she got at Jackson State. Everything she needed to know, she got under the tutelage of people like Margaret Walker, Dr. Jane Ellen McAllister, Horatio Henry, just a wide array of people who I felt like I knew because she talked about them. Willie Dobbs Blackburn, because she talked about them all the time. And to her, these people recognized that they weren't just imparting knowledge, they were helping to mold individuals. We work at the Margaret Walker Center, and there's a wonderful photograph in the Rod Page exhibit of his cohort of students at Jackson State as student athletes, all these strong, purposeful young men who would go on to become not just coaches, but school leaders, secretary of education. And all of that was under a tutelage they got at Jackson State. Because my mom wasn't an athlete, but she knew about John Merritt, who was the head football coach when she was there. He was Jackson State's Dion before Dion, Harrison Wilson, who's the grandfather of Russell Wilson, who plays now with the Denver Broncos. But these men, they didn't just impact the basketball court and the football field. They impacted all the students, here again, another wonderful picture is of Harrison Wilson taking the basketball team and presenting Mamie Ballard with a game ball after she had been struck by a car trying to cross Lynch Street. So these were the kinds of experience, and the interactions of students mostly from Mississippi, because at the time my parents were at Jackson State. The primary student body were young people from Mississippi. So you had exposure to people from throughout the state. And like I said, they developed lifelong friendships and working together. Because I think of it now, my dad's closest friend, my dad oftentimes doesn't remember a lot. He is dealing with, dementia and Alzheimer's. But if you ask him, where did you go to college? He says, Jackson State. Did you pledge a fraternity? And he goes, Omega Psi Phi. Like, what else? Where did you go over? Just Hall. He remembers those things. Those were experiences. Also, he talks about what an impact James Meredith had on him. He and James Meredith were both Air Force veterans. They were both students at Jackson State at the same time. And he saw, where Jackson State took a lot of pride in James Meredith's integration of Ole Miss. I had a church member who was actually working in the registrar's office, and she said her hands would literally shake because she just felt like she had to get his transcripts just right, because she wanted to make sure that his transcripts would not prevent him from getting into Ole Miss. So these were the kinds of, experiences, because to me, and this is just a personal thing, pre-integration, teachers not only took pride in teaching, but they took pride in their students, in wanting to see them be the best they could be, and realizing that education has to do more than just put knowledge in people's heads. It has to do more than that, because the community needs more than that. Because they're not just thinking about, what are these students going to do for themselves, or how are they going to impact their career in terms of evaluation. How are these students going to impact this community? For example, the West Jackson community, a lot of it was built by students who left Jackson State and built up this community. So that's, what they got out of Jackson State. And most, because I attended my mother's 50th class reunion, and, it's like 50 years hadn't passed. They were back to, a lot of the things they had been doing as students, and, when they were students here, because they had that pride and that love of it, really, a love for it.
Sounds like a lot of love.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my understanding of what you've said, both when you were talking about Jacob Reddix and sort of the history of Jackson State, and what you've just said about your parents' experience, it seems like they were probably a part of that sort of transitional period where Jackson State was going from, like you said, the sort of training of educators, particularly, to that younger student body, which is super interesting, because obviously that would have a huge impact on the experience your parents were able to have. So yeah, that's very interesting. I guess my next question is, you mentioned Margaret Walker a couple of times as being one of the educators for your mother during her time at Jackson State. And then you mentioned how, as a child, you were able to see Maya Angelou because she came after the Phillis Wheatley Festival, unable to come for the Phillis Wheatley Festival. So I wonder if you can, if we can, sort of move into your either personal experience of Margaret Walker and the work that she did, the events that she did at Jackson State, and also sort of what you know, having become an archivist here.
Okay.
And we can, I guess, start with Margaret Walker herself, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah. And let me just give a little bit background on Margaret Walker. Margaret Walker was the daughter of two educated parents who had firm ideas about what they wanted from their children, especially their two oldest children. Their two youngest children, I think, kind of benefited from being the babies. So it wasn't the kind of pressure on Gwen and brother that Mercedes and Margaret had as their two oldest children. But they were very focused parents, you know, and they critical, especially Margaret Walker's mother, she could be critical in the extreme. But they were growing, her parents had come up in a generation of segregation, of a lot of violence that they experienced, and a lot of being shut out of things, you know. Sigismund Walker was a highly educated man from Jamaica who attended Northwestern, where he got a master's in theology. You know, he had gone initially to Gammon Seminary in Atlanta, was now the International Theological Center, and he felt like he could see the limitations of what was offered at a historically black institution. And this was before Margaret Walker was born, and she was born in 1915, so you can imagine we're talking very early 20th century. And so that's why he sought out the opportunity to go to Northwestern and complete his degree. Margaret Walker's mother was also educated, and she even had a degree from Northwestern as well. And so you have these two very educated parents who want for their children a better life than what they had the opportunity to have. So when Margaret Walker is born July 7th, 1915, a month after her great-grandmother died, because her great-grandmother died in June of 1915, and her grandmother moves in with the family when she's born, and she's immediately looked at it as, this is our hope, this is our future. Because you have to understand, in 1915, you weren't guaranteed that your children were going to make it to 1 year old, you know. So they put a lot of hope and stock, and then when they realized that this was a child who between 3 and 5 was already reading and comprehending books, you know, this is a special child that you need to make sure she has all the opportunities she can have, and that she understands that the importance of these opportunities, and she puts pressure on herself to do better than just good. You know, there's an old saying that people had good, better, best, never let it rest, till your good is better and your better is best. And that was the focus of her parents. When Margaret Walker talked about she wanted to write, her dad brought her a date book and challenged her to write something every day for a year as sort of a test to see, because he thought, oh, this is just a childhood whim, she'll grow out of it. But she filled up 2 date books. And he said, wow, she's serious about this thing. And her parents had moved from Birmingham, where she was born, to Meridian, the Haven Institute, and then finally to New Orleans, where her parents taught at what is now Dillard University. And growing up on a college campus, she got the opportunity to see people like W.B. Du Bois, like Langston Hughes. So she got exposed to thoughts and ideas and writers. She could go to the library and plus her home and read magazines and books. So she had all this knowledge that she started journaling when she was about 12 or 13. We have her journals at the Margaret Walker Center. And she goes from, you can see her growth, because her first journal is basically school assignments. And she's taking stuff like high-level math and French, and she's transcribing poems. She loved Paul Laurence Dunbar, so she transcribes one of his entire poem into her journal. But it's not very, that first note is not very introspective. But the older she gets, she starts using, because her dad tells her in her relationship with her mom, write it down. You don't have to respond every time your mom says something. Because Margaret was that child who, if her mom said something, said why. And her mom said, because I said so, and that would just lead, and her dad would finally say, make life easier on yourself, not on me, because I'm a man who believes happy wife, happy life. Write it down. So she started, and you will see in her journals where my mother is horrible. And then you can, even in reading the journal, see where she takes a breath and she goes, she's not that bad, but I do and I understand where she's coming from. But at the moment, because she took her dad's advice, mom says something off the wall, and then, but you can see her come back to it and go. And then she had a younger sister, and this is the thing, when you grow up in a family with more than 2 children, there's always going to be one child who's like, I'm mama's backup. She said, if that Gwen would just mind her own business and leave my life alone. Because her siblings were like, why are you arguing with mama? Just say yes, mama, and keep going. You're bringing all this conflict. Because, when you're in a family, even though it's 2 people arguing, it gets to be the whole family. But I think it helped her creativity because it allowed her to write and, have to think about, And she wrote about her budding sexuality. Am I ready for a sexual relationship? Am I ready for a romantic relationship? At 17, she wrote down everything she wanted in a husband. And then years later, she went back and, well, my goodness, my husband was none of this stuff I had on this list, But she was always thinking about that, So that's who Margaret Walker was growing up. She had the opportunity to meet Langston Hughes, and he saw, and her parents made her share her poetry. They're like, you want to be a writer? He's a writer. Show him your poetry, because she was a little hesitant about sharing with him. And he said, wow, she's good. First thing, she needs to get out of the South. And so she and Mercedes would finish their last 2 years of college at Northwestern. But he also helped her get published in the Crisis magazine. And W.E.B. Du Bois was somebody she had seen before, and she would see again at Northwestern because he was doing speaking circuits. And he really impressed her. Matter of fact, some of her poetry in her later years is still talking about the impact of the seminal mind of W.E.B. Du Bois. But W.E.B. Du Bois is winding down his tenure as the editor of the magazine. He founded The Crisis, which is still the official magazine for the NAACP. And he publishes in 1934 her poem, she calls it Daydreams at the time, but she now calls it I Want to Write, about how she wants to write the songs of her people. And she's a young woman talking about this. She publishes in 1937 For My People. And this is a poem that she actually just wrote really quickly. In less than an hour, she had typed it out. But she then, thought about it. And she had people like Richard Wright to read it, who said it was some of her best work. And she got it published by the Journal Poetry. She finished at Northwestern. It is interesting, when she finished Northwestern, she had 300 pages of Jubilee written, but she put it aside because she felt like her poetry was what she needed to work on most urgently. So she worked for the Federal Writers Project. And she got into that because she had been volunteering for the WPA with young girls. At that time, they called them juvenile delinquents. I was reading a book by Mickey Kendall, what people call fast tail girls. And Margaret Walker gets into that. She kind of writes about that in a book she never published called either The Decoy or Goose Island, about that experience in Chicago. But she got to meet people like Richard Wright, who told her she was too smart to be so religious because he was a communist and an atheist, and she made her whole life a devout Christian. And she developed the idea of Christian rationalism or humanism, to say that faith doesn't mean you're stupid. It doesn't mean that you don't think that you can be a deeply believing person and a highly intelligent person. So that was something she developed early on. But she also got to meet writers like Margaret Burroughs and Gwendolyn Brooks, and just a wide array of people in Chicago that she wouldn't have known except for her work with the Federal Writers Project and the Southside Writers Group. And then she said, when the government decided, okay, enough of this, and they closed down the Federal Writers Project, she was like me. She decided, well, I guess I'll go to grad school. So she went to the State University of Iowa, and they had a brand new program called the Writers Workshop. And that's what she got her master's in, and she honed her poetry in that program. And she had been submitting her poetry to Yale University's younger poets and had been turned down twice. And finally, the third time, she was selected in 1942 as the first African American to win the Yale Younger Poets Prize. And part of that prize was a publishing contract to publish her first book of poetry, For My People. And so she's a published author. She's known by other authors. I mean, because she's met Ralph Ellison, Owen Dotson, she's met Sterling Brown. She knows a wide array of people, but she needs a job, So she ends up teaching. She teaches at West Virginia State University. She teaches at Livingstone College in North Carolina, and the most significant thing to come out of her teaching in North Carolina is that's where she'll ultimately meet her husband, Ernest Alexander, and they have a tumultuous relationship, and she has a daughter. She ends up going back home, and then they later get married. So, but in 1949, she had the opportunity to come to Jackson and Jackson State. And she writes in her journal about how excited she was about that, because she saw a progressive community in Jackson that she wanted to be a part of and work with. And she developed some lifelong friends at Jackson State. Mrs. Lottie Thornton, for whom the preschool at Jackson State is named. Her supervisor was Mrs. Willie Dobbs Blackburn, who also has a building named for her on campus. The librarian, Mrs. Ernestine Lipscomb, and her neighbor and the reference librarian at Jackson State, Bernice Lloyd Bell, and just Dr. Lydia Gadsden Rhodes, who is a sorority sister, and because Margaret Walker was a member of the Beta Delta Omega chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority here in Jackson. So she develops, all of these relationships, but as Miriam says, every child she had was a book she didn't write. In between being married and raising a family and teaching, and oftentimes, especially in those days, historically black schools were not like Ivy League schools where they hire a professor, and at best he might teach one course every other year, but he was mainly, or she was responsible for writing and publishing and, being this. No, you're expected to teach almost a high school teacher's load of courses and do other events. For example, in 1952, Jackson State would turn 75 years old, and they decided they needed a creative arts festival in celebration of the 75th anniversary, and they put that task on Margaret Walker. And she invited Langston Hughes, she invited Robert Hayden, she invited Melvin Tolson, she invited Arnold Bontemps. It's interesting, she invited mostly men. The one woman who attended that conference was Rose Mendiz, who actually was a local poet. But there's a wonderful picture of her and the writers and Jacob Reddicks. But that is something she did for the community. It wasn't just for Jackson State. So people in the community got to see Langston Hughes and, Sterling A. Brown and Robert Hayden and Owen Dotson and all of these other writers, and hear them speak and recite their poetry. It gave intimacy to literature, so that it wasn't just something you read in a book, and sometimes painfully. You take freshman lit and sophomore lit and things like that, and you're like, oh, if I never have to read some of these authors again in my life, I'm in good shape. but it gave, people an intimacy and made them feel like they knew these writers. Langston Hughes not only came to Jackson State, he would come to Piney Woods when he was in Mississippi. And a wonderful thing Piney Woods has in their collection is a collection of simple stories. Langston Hughes autographed "Thanks for the Greens" because Lawrence Jones sent him a box of collard greens to New York City because he found out Jessie B. Simple liked collard greens. But you had that intimacy with writers, and so she had to teach. She had to put on, events. She had to be active in the community because, it's not this ivory tower or black tower or whatever that you can just go and sit and write. And, she never had a consistent publisher or literary agent. So she was basically facing a lot of challenges, and the amount of writing she did do is amazing considering how she had 4 children. She had a husband who was disabled, and a lot of, like I said, work challenges because her dean and the president, they wanted faculty who would primarily teach. All this other stuff you're doing, we ain't paying you for that. This is, what we're paying you to do. And as she talks about, for her, it wasn't even just racism, but it was the oppressive sexism, because she made less than the men who worked, who had less education than she did, because they said, well, they're heads of household. And she's like, well, I have a family that needs support too. So these are the kinds of things,
Yeah. There's obviously a lot more still to talk about, but we have been at it for just about an hour.
Okay.
And I think it might be a good time to pause, maybe do lunch. So I'm going to stop here.